All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive shift in history, the dawn of the nuclear age, from false peace to superpower paranoia. We're going to explore exactly how the joyful, triumphant end of World War II rapidly morphed into a terrifying new global reality, a reality defined by intense, constant suspicion and the very real threat of total destruction.
Peace. It's wonderful. I mean, think about that simple phrase for a second. It perfectly captures the sheer, overwhelming relief that washed over the globe at the end of the war. After years of unimaginable devastation, the Allies had finally won. It was the day of days. The world could finally take a collective breath, and the cheering crowds in the streets truly believed that the absolute darkest days of human history were permanently in the rearview mirror.
But, that illusion of a simple, easy peace, it didn't last long. The dust had barely settled before the wartime allies were slammed with a grim, daunting geopolitical challenge. What exactly do we do with a defeated Germany? At first, there was this urgent, unifying consensus that the nation literally had to be divided, just to guarantee it could never rise up and drag the world into another horrific conflict.
So that brings us to Section 1, Dividing the Post-War World, the Fate of Germany.
Take a look at how this shook out. The resulting division sliced the nation into 4 distinct occupation zones. You had the Western Allies, the Americans, the British, and the French, taking the 3 zones that made up Western Germany, and then the Soviet Union took the East. But here is where the geography becomes a massive, massive liability. Berlin, the former capital of the Third Reich, sat deep within that Soviet zone. It was completely isolated in Soviet territory, yet the city itself was also carved up among all 4 nations. It was literally a geopolitical puzzle just waiting to trigger a major conflict.
Moving right along to Section 2, Rebuilding versus Reparations, 2 Opposing Visions.
So the victorious Allies basically had completely incompatible visions for the future. On one side, the Western Allies wanted to rehabilitate Germany economically. They didn't want to leave the country in ruins. They wanted to hook it back into global markets to incentivize constructive behavior rather than destructive resentment. But on the flip side, Stalin felt he was owed for the absolute horror and suffering his country had just endured. His game plan was to extract as much wealth, factories, and productive capacity as humanly possible from occupied Germany and ship it all back to the Soviet Union as reparations.
$324 million. That was the specific allotment of Marshall aid that poured in to help Western Germany temporarily get back on its feet. Now, Marshall aid was a hugely essential piece of the American post-war recovery plan. But here's the crazy paradox. Its very success in rebuilding Western Europe actually blew the economic and political divide between East and West wide open. It cemented a terrifying new reality. We had officially entered a bipolar world, one totally defined by intense rivalry and a relentless race for security, especially as the West increasingly realized that the Soviet Union just couldn't be trusted.
Which leads us right into Section 3, the Berlin Blockade and Airlift, the first major standoff.
Let's track this timeline because it escalates fast. By the summer of 1948, billions in Marshall aid were flowing in. By mid-1948, Britain and the U.S. merged their occupation zones, with the French following suit. Soon after, they rolled out a common currency, the Deutschmark. Now, put yourself in Stalin's shoes for a minute. If you're that paranoid, having Western militaries establishing a strong, independent West Germany right in your backyard is incredibly dangerous. Well, his paranoia boiled over. On June 24th, the Soviets cut every single road, rail, and water route linking West Berlin to Western Germany. The trains just stopped. So, faced with a starving, blockaded city, President Truman and the British had to ask themselves one terrifying question. What can we do short of war? Keep in mind, West Berlin was still mostly a pile of rubble. It had almost zero tactical significance for the U.S. military. Stalin figured the West would look at the math, realize it made no sense to stay, and just blink. But symbolically, giving it up meant handing a massive, unacceptable victory to the Soviet Union.
Well, the answer they came up with was nothing short of a logistical miracle, the Berlin Airlift. The crazy plan was to deliver absolutely everything a modern city needs to survive entirely from the sky. We're talking food, medicine, coal, fuel, the whole shebang. It required a massive fleet of aircraft flying round the clock. Amazingly, this air bridge was pulled together by the exact same officers who had orchestrated the logistical triumphs of World War II. And to win over the terrified locals, pilots even started dropping these tiny little parachutes made out of handkerchiefs loaded with candy for the kids. That's how they earned the legendary nickname, the Candy Bombers.
Make no mistake, this was an incredibly high-stakes gamble. The pressure on Truman was just off the charts.
He knew perfectly well that this massive aerial operation was highly provocative, it could easily trigger World War III. But he was making a calculated bet that Stalin, for all his aggression, didn't actually want to spark an accidental Armageddon. Truman was hoping this massive show of resolve would just force Stalin to back down.
1. That is exactly how many years this agonizing daily standoff lasted. For nearly an entire year, Stalin poked and prodded at Western resolve, trying to see just how far he could push before they broke. But Truman held firm. Finally, once Stalin realized that the air bridge simply wasn't going to fail, he halted the blockade and reopened the routes.
Now we hit Section 4, crossing the nuclear threshold, the ultimate complication.
The Soviet Union successfully tests its very first atomic bomb. Picture this, out in a desolate landscape, Stalin's mega manager, Lavrenti Beria, is watching from a little hut, absolutely sweating bullets, because he knew that if this test failed, he'd likely be executed. But then, the explosion boomed. The test was a total success, and in a single, blinding flash of light, the course of human history fundamentally shifted.
Think of it like a high-stakes game of poker. Before that test, Truman always had the ultimate ace in the hole. He had the atomic bomb, and the Soviets didn't. But after the test, that military supremacy vanished overnight. Stalin was absolutely overjoyed. The Soviets were suddenly on equal footing, and the West could no longer dictate terms. Just like that, you have two heavily armed nuclear superpowers staring each other down, injecting a terrifying new instability into global politics.
And that reality brings us to a really crucial concept: indirect competition. See, if you asked an old 18th or 19th century military scholar, they'd tell you that direct war between two massive rivals like this is 100% inevitable. But atomic weapons rewrote the math. The US and the Soviet Union literally couldn't fight a direct military war because it was just too dangerous for human survival. So instead, they were locked into this permanent, tense state of indirect competition. And that, right there, is the dawn of the Cold War.
I want to leave you with a really profound thought from our source material today. World War II ended in a landscape completely transformed by the splitting of the atom. The source argues that a bias for democracy and a deep appreciation for the individual are actually what have enabled humanity to survive in a world where Armageddon is always hovering right over our shoulders. It implies that this underlying moral framework is what kept us from stepping off the edge, which leaves us with a vital question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. In our current era, where new, equally terrifying global technologies are constantly being developed, will that same bias for democracy continue to be enough to save us from ourselves?